Hello and welcome to tonight's webinar, everybody. My name is Dennis Cannell. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns, and I'm just one of the many people at Egale who have worked hard to bring you tonight's webinar. I will be your moderator for tonight's session. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping details. First, please be aware that this session is being recorded and that we will be sharing a link to the recording with everyone after the session for your ongoing reference. Throughout tonight's session, there will be multiple opportunities for you to interact with us and with each other. Most of you will see the interaction buttons along the bottom of your webinar window. There are three: Q&A, chat, and hand raise. If you do not see these buttons, your browser or app may just be set to automatically minimize them. To open them up again, just scroll your mouse or swipe along the edge of your screen and they should pop up. Since the chat could get busy, I would kindly ask everyone to please reserve the Q&A button for technical assistance questions and for submitting any formal questions you have for the presenter. We aim to have a Q&A segment at the end of the session to answer any submitted questions, so please feel free to drop in any questions you think of as we go along. For all other discussions, please use the chat function. Also, if you would like to turn the captioning on or off, just click the CC button beside the chat button. Lastly, please note all participant microphones and cameras have been initially disabled for the duration of the webinar. Now that we're familiar with the room, I think it's time we can get started. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Katie, your facilitator for the evening.
Thanks so much, Dennis. I don't know, is it showing up on your screen? I have like a red line on mine. Is it showing up on yours?
I do see that.
I don't know what's happening. We're going to ignore that. I don't know why that's there. we're not underlining anything.
Anything there, yeah.
No, we will see what happened there. But thanks so much for joining us. I'm really glad that you are here. We are going to start our evening off with a brief land acknowledgement. We would like to offer up the idea to you that with this kind of like Zoom COVID world that we're living in, the idea of land acknowledgements have become a little bit less personal because we're all coming from different areas. I know from a few of our webinars, we've had people from across the country. So it's hard to do a land acknowledgement that's kind of rich and encompassing of all of the places where people are coming to us from. So what we have done is that we have decided to just acknowledge the land where the facilitator is facilitating from. So I'm from the Windsor, Essex area, and we would just like to recognize and appreciate and say that we're so grateful to be able to be sharing and learning with you tonight on the rightful land of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron people. And hopefully I pronounced those right because I had to do some learning this week about pronunciation.
Just with the term Haudenosaunee is the correct pronunciation. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm struggling with that one.
No problem.
So Dennis is also from the Windsor, Essex area, so has been helpful with that for me. So the reason that we do land acknowledgements, we are seeing to become more commonplace. But the reason that it's important, particularly important for us to do this before we have this discussion, is that we recognize that so many of the concepts around race, gender, and sexuality are based in white Western colonial systems of thought. So we want to just recognize right off the hop here with you tonight that many of the intricacies of the conversations we're going to be having tonight and many of the oppressions that folks are experiencing are because they are rooted in this colonialism to start. So if you are going to be teaching or talking about these concepts, it's important to recognize that piece right from the beginning. Just a little bit about Egale. So Egale as an organization has been around for 30 years, and largely what we do is we try to work towards an improved quality of life for the LGBTQI2S community in a variety of ways. So oftentimes that looks like education. That's primarily my involvement with Egale. Sometimes that's advocacy, and we have a whole team of people who are involved in the smaller working parts of that, like content development, project management, and such, that are here with us tonight. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about us, you can check out our website. It will be sent out in the chat if you are curious. So my name is Katie Casey, and I like to give, my pronouns are she and her. My kind of intention is to give you a little bit of background about who I am, because when we do these webinars, it's a lot of me talking at you for an hour and 15 minutes. So I'd like you to know kind of who it is that you're connecting with tonight. So I have an honors degree in psych. I started my kind of journey professionally working frontline at a shelter for sexual assault and domestic violence survivors. I did that for several years until I moved into working more nichely with sexual assault survivors. So I was the head of public education for the Sexual Assault Center in London for several years. I worked on a project with young male perpetrators of sexual violence, so grade school age young men who were perpetrators, to look at where we could do early intervention. I also did a project with the Sarnia Sexual Assault Center with the Center for Violence Against Women and Children at Western University, looking at marginalized populations and why they were not coming in for support after experiencing an assault. I was then hired at the University of Windsor, where I developed and delivered our sexual assault disclosure training to all of our faculty and staff. And I currently am managing a trauma-informed positive psychology and resiliency-based intervention program for students who are struggling. And I'm a sessional instructor at the college. I teach a course called #MeToo, which is all about, as you might have guessed, the Me Too movement and how social movements kind of get started, how they gain momentum, and how they kind of move through that life cycle. And then I've been working for Egale for about 7 years. So that's where I came to you from professionally tonight. On a personal note, like I said, I live in the Windsor, Essex area. My wife's name is Megan, and we have 3 kids, Indigo, Wild, and Sage. Wild and Sage are twins that were just born 14 weeks ago, so just a little over 3 months ago. So I am not sleeping a whole lot these days, so bear with me as I move through the content tonight. I'm a little sleep deprived. So that's who I am. I'm so glad that you are here to join us. If you have questions as we go, like I said, I am going to try and pop into the chat, but Dennis is going to be kind of keeping an eye on that for me. So if there's anything really kind of pressing that comes up, he'll let me know, and otherwise I'll kind of keep moving. Yeah, Dennis.
Oh no, I was just agreeing.
You're just agreeing. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Thanks. Thanks, Megan. Okay. So just so you know, for tonight, these are kind of our 4 portions of the agenda. The first piece is going to be brushing up on basics. Now, this piece is going to move quickly because we took a look at the incoming pre-registration questions. There was a large number of you who kind of had a good grasp on this content already, so we aren't going to spend a lot of time on it, but it is important for everybody to be on the same page before we kind of move into the more nuanced content. And then also, for those of you who are educators or may be in a position to be teaching this content, hopefully you find watching it be taught helpful, and you may find strategies or approaches to teaching the content that you find helpful. So we are going to move fairly quickly through that into naming the problem, which is a large part of the work that we're going to be doing together tonight, because much of what we're talking about tonight, so things like transphobia, rape culture, sexual violence, racism, things like that, are really deeply ingrained in our everyday culture. And in order to be able to challenge them in our own spaces and in a larger context, we have to be able to name them before we can do anything about it. So we're going to be talking about how do we tease those pieces apart, and how do we really clearly name them for what they are. The next section is transformative learning and strategy. So we're going to talk about what are some things that you can be doing in your own communities, schools, or spaces as a way of pushing back or creating change. And then our last portion will be putting learning into action, which we're going to be talking to you a little bit more in detail about the resources that will be available to you after this webinar is over. I do want you to know that this is a fairly high level approach that we're going to be taking tonight. So we aren't going to be getting into much of this content you could spend like an entire semester learning about in a really deep and meaningful way. We don't have time for that in this context. So we are going to be taking a high level approach, but the team at Egale has put together some really great resources for you to take back into your home spaces and use. So one of those things is going to be some community member profile cards and some scenarios, which I'm going to be talking to you about, but we're going to be kind of going through those in the last portion. Dennis, there's a question popping up. Do we need to?
Yeah, I was going to say before we move into the next piece, could we try refreshing maybe your screen sharing or the slides that you
Yeah,
have up just to try to get rid of that line? Because yeah, this is the first time we're seeing that as well.
sure. Let me see. That better?
Yep, it's
I'm
fine.
not seeing it now.
I don't see it either. All right, let's keep
Perfect.
going.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, and I will we'll take care of the Q&A answers
Towards the end.
either through chat or I'll bring it up on air as well.
Thanks so much, Dennis.
Yep.
I do want to say to you that one of the ways we're going to talk about creating cultures of consent in your own spaces is through content advisories. And so I want to say to you tonight that we are going to be talking about some really challenging topics. So specifically transphobia and sexual violence, which probably won't be a surprise to you tonight, but we are also going to be talking about how those intersect with many other forms of oppression, such as racism, misogyny, xenophobia. You know, we're going to be talking about a myriad of different oppressions, which I'm guessing that all of you that are attending tonight have either had direct experience with or somebody you love has had direct experience with. So I'm going to encourage you to take this content as is comfortable for you. So if you need to take a step out of the room for a moment and take a breather or a quick walk, that's cool. If you would like to listen to or watch the content on mute because the narrative is just creating too much detail for you, that's also okay. And if at the end of our time together, you feel like one of these resources would be helpful for you or somebody in your circles, that would be, we'd highly encourage you to take advantage of those. Okay, so we are going to start right in with brushing up on the basics. Now, we have all been kind of struggling with how to convey this kind of content in a rich way since COVID started. We've been doing a lot of webinars and we've here at Egale really had to kind of shift how we're teaching. And one of the things that we have found helpful to create some interaction in our webinars is through polls. So I'm just going to do the first one for you and kind of demonstrate for you how this would be rolled out if you wanted to use it. So the first question is, gender and sex are just different words that basically mean the same thing. So then you have the option there of multiple choice. Great. Good.
Answers are coming in. Looking
Yes,
good.
everybody must have done very well in the pre-registration.
They did. I believe this question was perfect. Yeah, we have some knowledgeable learners here with us tonight.
Great. Okay, so we just share that with you so that you can see a different way of engaging your audience. So normally when, in a pre-COVID world, when I was facilitating, you can get a bit of a read for the room. So you can tell if people look anxious, if they look bored, if they're engaged, if they're writing things down. There's lots of different cues that we take for finding out if people are engaged, and we can't always do that online. So this is one of the ways that we have come up with kind of reading the room, so to speak, to see. And as a facilitator, I have to tell you, I find it quite helpful because you can see that people are on the other side of the screen and they are engaged in what you're asking them to do. I would say to you, we want to be careful of not rolling the polls out like a test, especially around this content. People will feel likely a little bit anxious if you do that. So we just kind of frame this as we're getting a feel for kind of where everybody is at. So after we do the poll, we put out the answer, which is obviously false, and we got 100% of you got that right, so that's great. And then we would move into some explanation of that question content. So just so you know how we talk about the 4 components of human identity, we use Gendy, and so Gendy will, as you can see, displays for us that we have gender identity, which is our felt sense of gender identity, so who we feel we are as people in regards to gender. Then we have attraction. So attraction talks about who we're attracted to out in the world, based also on how we identify as people in regards to our gender identity. I think another important piece to talk about when we talk about attraction is that it's really good, especially with, I think, young folks, to talk about the different types of attraction. So the kind of succinct way that I have heard it talked about before is like head, heart, and pants feelings. So when we talk about head feelings, we think about like intellectual, friendship, perhaps, or like I like to connect with you around things that make my brain work, or kind of like make my neurons and synapses connect, right? Like I find you rich and engaging intellectually. When we think about heart feelings, I always explain this as like, this is when Cinderella's birds put your house coat on in the morning and like things are all mushy and twinkly and like, you know, squirrels are talking to you on the way to work kind of thing, because you're feeling just like that warm glow of kind of like oozy heart attraction feelings. And then we talk about pants feelings, we say like, oh, you know, maybe I'd like to do something without my pants on with this person. It's a really accessible way to talk to a large range of groups of people without going into deep detail, but really kind of teasing those pieces apart. It's also important to note that we are attracted to different people in lots of different ways and in lots of different combinations of those ways. So we're not just talking about sexual attraction, we're talking about all types of attraction when we talk attraction. The next piece is assigned sex. So when we say assigned sex, we mean generally that like the baby is born, the doctor takes a look at their physiology and says like, it's a boy, it's a girl. And then that's kind of how you're supposed to move through the world. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. But when we're talking about assigned sex, we're talking about like at birth, usually what sex medical professionals have assigned to you. And then we're also talking about gender expression, and gender expression is about how we move through the world and how we would like to be read as we move through the world in regards to our gender. A couple of important pieces around that are that we all make decisions about this. So this can seem kind of like a fringe idea, but it's really not. We all make decisions when we get up in the morning about like how we're going to wear our hair, what jewelry we're going to wear, whether we're going to put on makeup, what clothes we're going to wear to either emphasize or de-emphasize bodily characteristics. So we're all making these decisions about how we want to be seen when we move through the world. I was joking with our last webinar that maybe only from the waist up because of Zoom. So we have Zoom and you know, Teams calls where we're maybe wearing our pajamas on the bottom, but taking a little more care with our top half. But this is not kind of like that much of a foreign concept if we want to kind of ground that for people, if this is new information for them. The other piece we want to think about when we're thinking about gender expression is that accessibility to the ability to be read like you would like to be read. So sometimes for folks that means access to certain types of clothing or binders, surgeries, you know, makeup or clothing, or even depending on where you are in your experience when that kind of started, when the transition started for you, could also alter how you're able to be read out in the world, depending on how you feel. So it's important to note that sometimes people are being read in ways that they don't love, not because that was their intention, but because they didn't have access to something different. So just keeping that in mind when we're talking about gender expression. Lastly, we just want to also highlight that all of these 4 components are distinct and independent, and that all combinations are valid, and there are a ton of different combinations of these 4 categories to make up a person and their gender identity, attraction, sex and expression. So you are going to get access to some community profiles. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you a more complete tour towards the end, but there are 5 community member profiles that have been created as a resource for you to use. And you'll have access immediately after this webinar. But Annika is one of those community member profiles, and they use the pronouns they and them. There's a little bit of information about Annika in the profile, and we also encourage you to add on to that if you find that helpful. The resources are really designed so that you can take them into your own situations and add on or mold or shift them as you find helpful. But this might be a great way for you to have conversations about these 4 components of identity. Traditionally, what we've done is that the Egale facilitator would kind of walk through our own 4 pieces of these identity, which I'm comfortable doing, but perhaps you aren't, or other folks in your spaces are not. So using these community member profile cards to talk about these 4 categories really removes any need for anybody to disclose anything they don't feel comfortable with. So we're not going to actually do these polls, but I will demonstrate for you how this would work. So this would be a poll, and the next question is, describing someone as normal or not trans is the same thing as describing them as cisgender, which is false. So when we think about the term cisgender, we think of the Latin on the same side. So cis meaning on the same side. And what we're talking about is a person who identifies with the gender that is associated with the sex they were assigned at birth and in line with dominant social expectations. So what this means is that if when you're born and the doctor says it's a girl and you're like, yeah, this feels good for me, I feel like girl feels good for me, then we would think of that as a cisgender identity. What happens when we kind of refer to cis folks as real or normal or typical, even if we're not using trans in an overtly othering way? What we're saying is that only cis folk are real or normal or typical, and that anything outside of that is abnormal or weird or strange, and it can be a really othering experience. So we don't want to conflate the idea of cisgender with normalcy. We just want to use the term cisgender. Our next question is, trans is an umbrella term that represents an ever-evolving range of identities and experiences, which is true. So on this slide, we're going to talk about the kind of concept of transgender. So when the baby's born, they say it's a girl, and this little human says, like that doesn't feel, girl doesn't feel particularly right for me. So the idea of trans is, we want to think about the Latin term trans meaning on the other side, which can be actually a little bit misleading because it suggests this idea that it's like total opposite. And it's not actually the totally opposite, which we're going to talk about, because a trans individual is somebody who does not identify either fully or in part with the gender associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. So what we want to think about, we want to be a little bit careful when we're talking about trans identities in like an opposite sort of way, because it's not always as clear as like, yep, this is in line, and nope, it's not. Oftentimes they're like, well, you know, part of this feels good for me, but this part doesn't, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Another community member profile at the bottom here is Rory, and Rory's identifies as a transmasculine human, and there's a bit more information in the scenarios and the community member profile cards you can read about, but this would be a great resource if you're having conversations about how we define the term trans in your own spaces. So when we want to talk about trans as an umbrella term, because we would like to make sure that kind of all of those experiences are included when we talk about trans identities. And that can mean a wide variation of lived experiences for lots of different people. So you can see down here at the bottom is all of our folks, our community members are all kind of having a party down here on the left-hand side of the screen. And all of them have different experiences, and you can read about them after tonight's webinar. But there's a wide representation of experiences, including but like not limited to folks who are gender fluid, non-binary, agender, gender non-conforming. So the only term that folks who are like myself, who are settlers, cannot access is two-spirit. So we don't want to, if we are not of Indigenous descent, we don't have access to the term two-spirit. There's particular experiences of violence and oppression that Indigenous two-spirited folks have experienced that we have not. So we don't want to assume that we can use that term. So making sure that sometimes what we see happen with folks who are just learning is they say, no, like two-spirit feels like a term that is like, I could adopt that term, but we want to make sure we're sharing with people that unless you're of Indigenous identity, that we're not using that term. And I think, Dennis, you had a new one that you shared with us on Tuesday.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. So there's another term that's become pretty popular since it was released in 2017, and that's indigiqueer. And so folks might be familiar with that term. It was coined by Joshua Whitehead, I believe, in 2017 from their book that they released.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, I think that just speaks to also making sure that beyond this webinar, that you're also kind of keeping your eye out for new terminology as it emerges. That was a new one for me just this week. So hopefully that's helpful. We just want to remember that when we're thinking about the term trans, it's not just about folks who like fully don't identify and then folks who do. We're going to talk about that now. So the next question is, all trans people transition in order to be perceived as cisgender. So we would put that poll up, and the answer to that is false. What's important to note about this piece of learning is that the assumption that all trans folks want to be perceived as cisgender is pretty deeply transphobic in what happens then is that there is a total erasure of trans identities. So don't just want to assume that, I mean, some folks may want to be perceived as cisgender, and that's, you know, their prerogative, but we don't want to make the assumption that all folks who identify as trans don't want to be seen as trans. They want to be seen as cisgender, because that's transphobic in nature itself. Also, I think that what's important when we're talking about types or ways to transition is that it's not a linear experience for lots of folks. So many trans individuals, you know, it's not that you start on one side and end up at the other completely and fully as we tend to think of this. There are lots of ways and areas of life to transition in. So some folks may choose, we think about generally kind of like social transition, legal transition, and physiological transition. And some folks may transition only in part in all of those categories. So they may be out or transitioning in some social circles, but not in others. They may decide to do, you know, hormone therapy, but choose not to do any sort of surgical procedures at all. They may choose to do none of those things, but only a transition with clothing and perhaps binders or makeup or hairstyles and things like that. So there's lots of different combinations for what feels good for those individuals in their own bodies. So we want to think of it as what is it that those folks want to do to feel kind of at home and comfortable in their own bodies. And it doesn't mean that they have to completely and totally transition in all ways and in all areas for that to be valid.
And yeah, just a note that like gender is self-determined and self-defined. The only person who has can tell you who you are is yourself. So for gender to feel more of something that you have control over instead of other folks telling you what your gender is.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dennis. And then we had the question, gender diversity is a relatively recent phenomenon in society and therefore mostly found in younger populations. This is false. I know that sometimes there is some dialogue that happens. I know I've heard this I know my dad has said to me, like, this wasn't a thing when I was in high school. And I'm like, well, yes, it was a thing. It just wasn't a safe thing or a less safe thing back in 1974. So I think that what we want to acknowledge is that when we talked back in the land acknowledgement about a really colonial point of view, this is one of the things we're talking about. So for time unending, there have been cultures out there in the world that have recognized, celebrated, and seen many different gender representation or gender identities, and they have seen them as valid and often even revered. And the idea that this is a new concept is really a colonial and like white supremacist kind of view of things. So out there in the world beyond our own kind of sphere, this has been a thing that has been recognized and celebrated for a really long time. I think it is perhaps worth having the conversation that I would like to think that since 1974, things have changed in the world. So perhaps we are doing a good job of making the world seem like a little bit of a safer place for these individuals to be seen. But it is really important to acknowledge it. It's not that we didn't exist, it's that we didn't feel safe to be visible. And having those conversations can be a really important one with people in your lives if that is a thing that's coming up in your Easter dinner conversations. Okay, so that was a kind of, crash course, so to speak, in the brushing up on the basics. If you are teaching this sort of content in your own areas, I highly recommend using the community member cards. It is a great way to talk about the 101 materials. So if you have joined us in a workshop before, when we first did our first couple of these webinars, I struggled to keep this first part really succinct because I'm used to an entire day to talk about all of the kind of detailed pieces of this content. So if you are kind of in a place where you are teaching this content to a newer audience, you can use these to talk about the 101 content. You can use it in relation to the Gendy component. So what we want to be thinking about is these concepts. When we have Gendy and we have these 4 concepts, these 4 pieces of identity, the community member profiles will allow you to really ground that kind of theoretical in an actual human experience. So we want you to be able to be tying concepts, theories, and stuff around the glossary with these community member cards in a more real way. So that includes things like pronoun practice and language and labels. So hopefully you find that helpful. We are going to move now. Dennis, how are we doing for time?
Yeah, we're doing good.
Good. So we are going to move into the portion of tonight's webinar. We're going to talk about naming the problem. And I think that for me as a facilitator, I was saying to Jack, who developed this content, that this was, oh my goodness, this content, in order to deliver it effectively, was really hard for me to wrap my head around. And I think part of that, if I'm being honest, is because I was doing some continued learning around the content. So this is kind of the heavier stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight. And I would encourage you to jump in with questions or commentary or knowledge that you have that would be helpful for others as we move through it, because this is kind of where we're going to settle in for the next couple of minutes. Because it's really important for us to be able to have a thorough understanding of naming the problem for what it is before we talk about transformative or learning strategies. So I'm going to try and keep a good eye on the chat as we go. So we are going to start with the concept of cis-heterosexism. And if we're going to kind of put this in a nutshell, cis-heterosexism is the concept that those 4 components of identity that we have already spoken about tonight work and play out in a particular way that is prescribed to us by the predominant culture. So when we are born, we are assigned the sex of female. So, the baby's born, the doctor says it's a girl, and then they move on to be like, yep, okay, I'll fall in line with that. I feel like a girl, or what I envision to be what being a girl means. And then not only that, they're then going to also express that both assigned sex and gender identity in a way that is prescribed and comfortable for their particular culture, community, or situation. And then to kind of close the circle, that person who is assigned sex and also then assumed the gender identity that was in line with their assigned sex, and then expressed that gender identity in a way that was comfortable and in line with expectations, was also going to experience a heterosexual attraction. So if they were assigned female at birth, they were then going to be attracted to male identified humans. This is not rocket science. We think about this concept, like this is so deeply embedded for us that you're probably going like, this is not seeming like a revelation. But what I want to bring to your attention is that this doesn't just play out for visibly queer individuals. This plays out for all of us in really complex ways, and kind of insidiously and reinforces a culture that then supports transphobia and violence, which we're going to be talking about. So I just had assigned male and assigned female at birth twins, and let me please tell you, I've been sharing with my team that if you want to teach a webinar on transphobia and sexual violence, and you're talking about concepts of gender, it is like a study to be raising, boy-girl twins. And some of the ways that has shown up for us is that when they were born at 27 weeks, they were born very early, and we spent 12 weeks in the NICU. And I cannot say enough nice things about the team there. They literally saved my baby's lives. But what I found interesting is they were like, making sure that they were breathing and eating and had feeding tubes and PICC lines and all this really like medical stuff. But they were also really sure to make sure that Wild only had like dinosaurs and blue baseball sheets in his little glass isolette, and that Sage only had, like pink and yellow and flowered sheets in her isolette. It was like, I actually witnessed some of the nurses switch out completely clean laundry for other like gender appropriate sheets in their isolettes, which can seem kind of funny when I share that narrative with you now. But I want you just to think about, like, they have so much work to do in the NICU, and it felt important enough for some of them to make sure that those babies who like couldn't breathe on their own were resting on sheets that were gender appropriate, which I think is really interesting. I'm not faulting them. I'm just saying, like that starts before you can even breathe on your own. And then I think we just went back for our couple-week checkup back at the hospital. We had the babies in car seats, and both of the babies have floral car seat covers, like the ones that stretch over the top to keep the germs out. And what we have really been struggling with is dressing the babies in ways that don't feel either that we're like, really purposefully going against gender norms or really kind of lazily going along with them. And so we've started, we have two outfits. Megan mixes them up, puts them behind her back and says, not every day, but we're going out. Which one right hand is what Wild's wearing? So Wild was wearing pink that day and Sage was wearing green. And 100% of the time we ran into folks, they assumed that the baby wearing pink was the assigned female at birth baby, and the baby wearing green was the assigned male at birth baby, or that we had two assigned female at birth babies in the car seats because they both had floral car seat covers. I don't know about you, but most of the little babies in my life, I know they're out in the gardens. All of the babies like flowers. So I don't know who decided that flowers were only a thing for assigned female babies or children. So it just starts really early. And also as parents, we have an older daughter who's 4. The pushback that we have gotten around how we dress our children has been pretty intense at times. So it's not just like, oh, I thought that was a girl. They're like, you get kind of the snide comments, or the like, oh, why would you dress them in that? Or why would you dress her in that? It's really pushing back at the norm really does have consequences, which we're going to talk about now. So when we think about these norms of the cis-heterosexism and all those 4 pieces falling in line, what is important to remember is that norms are upheld with reward and with punishment. So there's all of these little bubbles on the left-hand side of the screen here. So we think about desirability, visibility, positive representation, a sense of belonging, a sense of safety, a sense of like, visibility. we are awarded access to many of these things when we fall in line with all four pieces of our identity. When we don't, or when we fail to align with that, we are blocked from access to many of these concepts. So this is not just, again, I think like for adult queer identified people moving through the world, this plays out for us in lots of really real ways. And I'm sure actually, if you were to think about this, that many of you who are here tonight with us have probably stepped outside of the like gender expectation in some way, shape, or form, and been very quickly corrected around that, whether as a child or as an adult. That could be as little as, you know, a haircut, a dress, a style of dress, or a behavioral characteristic. So I share with you that a little human in my life who is 9 played hockey last year, and she was assigned female at birth, and it so far identifies as cisgender. But because they're 9, have no discernible gender expression of physiological signs that they are assigned female at birth, and choose to wear their hair quite short. So her hair is, you know, identifiable oftentimes with little humans, and really likes more what we would traditionally expect the expression for masculine presenting folks. That's the kind of clothes that she likes. So last year she was in a hockey tournament, and she walked into the hockey change room with her bag, and ultimately the other little girls in the change room did not believe that she was a girl, or and what they actually ended up forcing her to do was to like drop her clothing and expose her genitals to prove that she was a girl, so that they didn't kick her out of the change room. Or I mean, it was never overtly kind of threatened, but there was the threat of kind of violence or danger for her. Like she felt threatened enough that she complied with removing her clothing. So I want you just to think about, A, this is happening earlier, and B, those other little girls in the change room not only understood what the expectation was around gender expression, but also felt emboldened enough to force her to remove her clothing to prove her assigned sex. So I want you just to think about, like, really kind of sit with what must be happening if 9-year-olds can understand that.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, you know, there was a comment in the chat from Megan speaking to their experience in the outdoor education recreation world, where it's a great example as well. When they were a kid, I got a lot of, wouldn't you rather stay in a nice hotel than go camping or hiking? And another example that I like to make when we get to this slide is when talking about like norms being upheld and with rewards and punishments. A lot of people coming and joining us tonight come from school communities, or any other place where folks might socially gather. A lot of these things in the bubbles are things that are at play. So there's acceptance within school communities. There's senses of safety. You want to belong. Are you getting the right access to resources? So I think it comes up a lot in schools where there's a lot of reward and punishment based on how you define your gender, how you understand your gender, and things like that. And I think that's why sometimes schools can be sometimes such an unsafe place, because that's where a lot of these rewards and punishments are at play. And it can be really difficult for trans, non-binary, gender diverse youth to be going through that. And then you spoke of your own the experience that you shared of the person that you knew in the change room. That's just like another piece where folks feel like they might have entitlement to someone's body, right? Which I know we're going to be talking about a little bit later.
Yeah, I think lastly, what I would like to note about this is that also, as I use the term queer for myself. So as a queer individual, when I move through the world, for the most part, my gender expression is in line with what we would expect for that's what feels good for me. So I identify as a cisgender woman who, for the most part, enjoys dressing my body and presenting my body in a way that is in line with what we would expect in our culture. What that means though sometimes is that I have to make the decision to that last kind of chink there around those 4 pieces of identity. My attraction is that I kind of always have to be making the decision about whether or not to disclose that part of my identity in many different spaces over and over and over and over again. And also recognizing that if I disclose that part of my identity, is that going to revoke my access to those things? So I know my wife and I were out at Winners today with the babies, and we were both wearing a baby. And I have to tell you, people stare because they cannot figure out how our family fits together, because we parent. So I'm chest feeding right now. So if we're out, my wife will switch out babies while I'm feeding them, or she'll diaper one, or do things that would be traditionally a parental kind of act. But people are not sure if we're like friends who both have babies at the same age, if we are sisters, or if I just have like a really good friend who's super helpful when I'm out and about, or if we're married. So it's just an interesting thought too, to think about that it's not just a one-time thing. If you have the ability to choose whether or not to reveal those pieces of your identity is one thing, but then also that has to happen multiple times in like multiple different situations.
Yeah, and there's privilege with having the ability to choose if you want to reveal that part of yourself as well.
Yeah, for some folks, we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides here, that's not an option. Like you can, especially if you are visibly a person of color, you can't choose to not walk through the world as a person of color. That's not something that is optional to you. It is an option for me most of the time to choose whether or not I disclose my attraction. Okay, so we want to just also discuss how transphobia shows up for trans folks. And I just kind of want you to be thinking about with this slide, how these different experiences of transphobia can interconnect. So we want to think about, I work in a post-secondary setting, so we know that the rates of graduation are lower for members of the LGBTQ I2S community. So we know that that's already a challenge. So if you are a trans individual and you are struggling to, you run into transphobic instructors, or there are a myriad of other kind of ways that transphobia shows up in post-secondary. So in that sphere of your life, there is some experience of transphobia happening. And then you also perhaps are looking to engage in a dating or intimate partner relationship, and there's the whole myriad of things. I think actually, Jack, there is it's perhaps sent out, but Tinder has a whole video that we were watching about how online dating for the trans community is a particular experience around things like when you disclose your trans identity to a potential romantic partner, sexual partner, and when does that come up? How does that come up? How different trans folks have approached that. So thinking about all the intricacies with school, all the intricacies and experiences of transphobia in dating and intimate partner relationships. And then if we also wanted to think that perhaps this person would like to, they're looking for employment, but are also experiencing transphobia in the employment sphere of their life, and how all of these different experiences are interconnected and compound for those individuals. And I know that Dennis last week had shared with me that I was using the term that because of their trans identity, they experience XYZ. But I think it's important just from a language standpoint, Dennis had gently kind of challenged that we want to make sure that we're framing this as a transphobia issue, not because these trans folks are not experiencing these experiences of transphobia because they're trans, they're experiencing it because of transphobia and other intersecting forms of oppression. Did you want to add anything to that, Dennis? I feel like you're kind of articulate about that last week.
Yeah, I think you did articulate it quite well, and I think it's important to bring up, though, just for folks listening today who, identify as trans themselves, I think it's an important acknowledgement to make within yourself around, the bullying or the discrimination or oppression that you might be experiencing in, your school or your communities is not because of you being trans, but because of transphobia, because of that greater system at play. And I knew that was sort of transformative for me as well in experiencing homophobia. I don't have these things because, naturally gay, queer, non-binary, trans people, um, you know, experience those things just because of their identity, but it's because of the oppression that is reinforced upon us. So I think that's just like an important distinction to make.
Yeah, especially I think for if you're working in schools with younger folks who are coming perhaps maybe to the parts of their identity in a new way, it's really important to note that to them, and for us to also reflect that in the language that we're using when we talk about transphobia and instances of transphobia in our own spaces. Okay, so the this image here is we call it the eyeshadow palette of oppression, because that's kind of what it looks like. But when we are looking at this image, we want to be thinking about the concept of intersectionality and how those different systems converge, connect, and amplify for certain individuals. So I read a really great article or post that Jack had sent me this week, and it was an expansion moment as far as learning goes for me, because traditionally I think we have been thinking about intersecting oppression as this idea of oppressions being compound. So if I use the example of my little human, her name's Indigo, and she's a multiracial cisgender girl so far that we know of, and she is also comes from a 2-mom crew house and has something called ventricular megaly, which means that her brain ventricles are about 3 times the size that the typical brain would have, and that's caused a bunch of neurological stuff. But one of the really visible things is that both of her hands do the same thing at the same time. It's called mirroring, and doing your bread, your hands crunch at the same time because you're holding the knife, doing up buttons, shoelaces, things like that. So that's been a quite visible and no, she's not nearly typical, and that's quite visible for her. So when we're looking at this kind of eyeshadow palette, we think about some of these systems of oppression that might affect Indigo are things like sexism, misogyny, homophobia, patriarchy, anti-Black racism, and ableism. So what we have traditionally thought about is that, okay, so we would kind of count it, if we were to think of oppressions as weights. So we're thinking, like sexism weighs 10 pounds, patriarchy weighs 10 pounds, homophobia weighs 10 pounds, and we kind of add up the additive experience of oppressions for an individual. And that's true, not to say that that's not happening, but I think what that, for me anyways, has not been speaking to is that we also need to be paying attention to the particular combinations of systems of oppression and how that's experienced for both the individual themselves and their situation. So when I think about it's not just when we think about perhaps for Indigo, for example, she's not only going to be experiencing anti-Black racism and ableism, but we're to think about like what is the particular history connected to the Black community and the differently able communities, and how those interplay with each other. Like how do those interweave so that we can't really tease them apart? So maybe that particular combination weighs 120 pounds instead of that even 100 because of the 2 compounded weights of oppression. We want to think about like, how do these 2 oppressions relate to one another? How do they interweave, and how does that person experience oppression because of their particular their particular identities. So this is it's a hard one to wrap our heads around, but what I'm just gonna skip ahead and I'll come back to the next slide. But when we're thinking about intersection in this particular way, I want to talk about the terms transmisogyny and transmisogynoir. So when we think about transmisogyny, Julie Serrano coined this term, and this is the particular experience of somebody who is trans feminine. So they would experience both the heteropatriarchy, so sexism and misogyny, and cissexism or transphobia. And we want to think about what does that look like for somebody who is trans feminine, because that's not, we can't just say that they experience a blanket experience of transphobia, because their particular experience of transphobia is different because of their feminine identity or feminine presentation. So we can't just blanket paint that experience as a transphobic experience. We have to also think about, like, how does that experience of sexism and misogyny and patriarchy play out for somebody who is identifies as female or a feminine and trans. So we want to think about, like, how does that mix together and play out. On that same note, we want to think about the term transmisogynoir, who was coined by Moya Bailey, and that term is discussing the particular experience of someone who is trans feminine and a person of color or Black. So we want to think about that person experiencing white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and cissexism. And there's a whole bunch of history in white supremacy around homophobia, misogyny, and that particular history comes with a weight to it that somebody who is experiencing transmisogyny is not going to experience. So we want to think about not only systems of oppression as compounding, which I was previously thinking of things as, but also how those different systems, histories, and experiences interplay, because we can't allies to be really paying attention to and understanding, to the best of our ability, the particular experiences of the people in our lives if we're going to be advocating for them or for change. Dennis, do you have anything to add to that at all?
No.
I know we were discussing this a little bit as a team beforehand.
Yeah. No, I don't think anything to add there, but I just did want to note if folks are experiencing a bit of like a lower quality of audio, you are just sort of choppy a little bit in that last piece, but I don't think we missed anything in particular. But if folks do have issues with that moving forward, just feel free to put it in the chat. Maybe Katie could go back and explain anything that perhaps was not heard properly.
Okay, so hopefully you understood, you heard all that. What I want to about in a nutshell is not only how the additive way that we have been thinking about oppression, but also the interplay between particular oppressions that are going to inform the experience of the individual. So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully you heard kind of the last portion of things. If you have any questions, please make sure to put them up in the chat, and I'll do my best to kind of explain if you've missed pieces. I also just want to discuss the concept of rape culture. Sorry I jumped ahead there on you, but when we talk about rape culture, we think about the normalization of sexual violence throughout society and how it's reinforced through the objectification and domination over women and femininity. And it shows up in things like jokes, media, jargon, legislation, advertising, imagery. It's really, really deeply ingrained in our culture. And I want to say to you that I've been doing anti-sexual violence work for over a decade. And when I was, fresh out of university and doing education work, I was going into schools, and my main objective, not to schools, but also professional spaces, and my main objective was to convince them that rape culture really was a thing. Like we were really we were watching documentaries like Killing Us Softly, and we were just really kind of making the argument that rape culture existed. I am really encouraged to be able to say to you that I think that the conversation on that has shifted significantly. I think particularly with the onset of the movements like #MeToo, we have really shifted the conversation from, standing on our soapbox saying this is a thing, this is really happening, to what can we be doing about it. And this is the more nuanced ways that rape culture plays out for certain folks. So I think that when we think about transmisogyny, transmisogynoir, different intersecting ways that transphobia shows up, or forms of oppression, and rape culture, I think the connecting piece here is that there is a kind of like an assumed access to bodies that the broader culture has around all of these communities. So it's this assumption that we have ownership or access or a right to ask questions or inflict acts upon the bodies of all of these communities. So when we think about why there is such a strong, because we know that trans feminine folks of color experience the highest rates of sexual violence of any other community. What we think about is that what that particular group is experiencing such an assumption or right to access to their bodies. So I want you to be thinking about that kind of as the unifying string around all these concepts as we talk about them. So that's kind of like the tying together piece between transphobia and sexual violence, is just this assumption that we have, that the broader culture has access to and rights to our bodies. Oh, it's not shifting there, sorry. So some of the patterns of transphobic violence that you may be seeing or hearing about are things like passing and clocking, hypersexualization and objectification or trans chasing, the trans panic defense, cis entitlement to trans disclosure. So this is when we talk about like the assumed entitlement to bodies for both for these communities. I want you to think about that oftentimes cis folks believe that they have the right to know about a trans person's identity. And I think what's really problematic about that is that it's deeply rooted in the transphobic belief that trans folk are being deceptive in some way, shape, or form by living their lives as who they feel they are. So I think that is happening in many different forms and in lots of different ways, and just making sure that we're thinking about that when we're working perhaps with folks in our own communities. And then also corrective rape and violence. And this is one of those situations where I think if we were to think about trans like not all trans folks are trans feminine. There's also trans masculine folks out there who are also experiencing corrective rape because of misogyny, because of a whole complicated concept around how dare you not live out your life in a way that I'm going to find you most attractive, or that I don't have access to your body anymore. So when we're talking about how those particular experiences play out and interplay, I want you to be thinking about how both misogyny and transphobia would play out for trans masculine folks as well, because we have already talked about trans feminine folks tonight. Okay, this is the pyramid of violence, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but what is important for you to know about this is that if the bottom pieces, so the biases and microaggressions, harassment and discrimination, are not allowed to exist in our communities and spaces or are routinely challenged, then it is much less likely that the kind of like higher pieces of the pyramid are going to be happening. So violence and dehumanization. We're seeing this. I know, Dennis, you were saying last week that you were using this pyramid in the discussion around the anti-Asian like hate crimes that are happening currently due to the pandemic. We're seeing the like a real and enormous surge in anti-Asian hate crimes, and how what we want to be thinking about is if you're challenging all of the rape jokes, if you are saying like, I don't think that's cool when you see a microaggression happening, if you are perhaps intervening or doing bystander intervention when there's harassment or discrimination happening in those spaces where those things are being challenged, it's going to be much more shocking and much less likely for dehumanization and violence to be happening. So it might feel to you tonight when we're talking about these really big concepts that seem so prevalent and so deeply ingrained in our culture that our actions are a bit of a drop in the bucket. But what is really so important is you don't have to get out there and have bystander intervention happen during a sexual assault in order to make a change. If you are, over Easter dinner in the next couple of weeks, if you are getting together with your people or in Zoom calls with your friends and you're playing video games and somebody says something transphobic or that in support of rape culture and you're challenging those things, you're kind of eroding this pyramid from the bottom up. And it's really important work, because if the bottom stuff is not allowed to happen, it's much less likely that the more intense violence is going to happen later on in both your like individual circles and your broader communities. So we're going to talk briefly about transformative learning and strategy. And one of the ways that we can think about proactive strategies in your own schools or communities is cultivating cultures of consent. So what I mean by that is things like considering power dynamics in which a person must navigate consent and the felt experience of a person, not just the compliance with the contract. So previously, when we were doing consent work, the big push was to make sure you were getting consent. What that kind of ended up translating into was this idea that did you get the consent passport stamped, and then you didn't really think about it after that. What a culture of consent is encouraging is this kind of ongoing felt sense of consent throughout the entire interaction, A, and B, that it's actually being played out in ways that are not to do with sexual interactions or intimacy. So we also would be wanting to think about things like content advisories. If you're on social media, asking if you can share somebody's personal post if it hit home for you. And modeling for our little people around, like, did it look like it felt good for that, for you to hold Tommy's hand on the playground? I know one of the ways we're doing this with our daughter is she tends to be a bit of a ruffian with the cat at home. So asking, does it look like Snoop's enjoying that? Because that sounds silly, but what's going to happen when she moves through life is that she's learning to pay attention to the cues of the beings that she's touching to see if it looks like they're enjoying themselves, which is ultimately kind of where we want to end up. So that's one of the ways that we can a proactive strategy for pushback or action against transphobia and sexual violence. You can also do things in your own spaces, like making sure you have accessible and inclusive washrooms and sports teams, trans-affirming GSAs. You're having discussions about pronouns and inclusive language. One of the small things is, I know at the university, it's become really commonplace that all of us have our pronouns in the bottom of our email signature. So it's just become a thing that everybody does so that it doesn't out anybody unnecessarily, and also just really normalizes the practice of sharing our pronouns in our space. Okay. So what I would like to, I'm going to skip this piece because what I would like to share with you now is our resources that are going to be available after the webinar, because there is a ton of content and I want you to be able to see it. So I don't know why. Oh, here we are. I think this is it. Yes.
Yep, I see it.
So this is the website. And you may be registered here, but you're also going to see a webinar recording after in the next couple of weeks, and all of these kind of there's our registration. We also have a content advisory. So this is another way that you can model cultivating a culture of consent virtually. And then the resources are organized in the same way that tonight's webinar was. So if you want to be doing some more learning in any of those areas, you can do so. Come here and take a look at what we have for you. And if you come down here, you'll see that there are two sections here. So putting learning into action 1 and putting learning into action 2. Putting learning into action 1, so the one over here on the left, this is all about bystander intervention and kind of drawing connections between the glossary and the big concepts that we talked about tonight. So if you click on it, you'll see that, I'll go back, started at the end here. But you can see that this will tell you how to use the resource. It gives you the breakdown. So it talks about activating past bystander experiences, strategizing for action in the future, and also the scenarios. So there's all these resources you can see. Questions you can use to facilitate discussions with your own students or coworkers about intervention. But there's also these community member profiles and the scenarios. So please feel free to take a look through these. I know that we were encouraging folks to not just take these scenarios and profiles at face value. If you want to add to them, or you want to add, we talked about with gender expression, folks who have access or don't have access to the things that allow them to be read as they would like to, you can add on pieces about those individual members' lives as you need. Really feel free to kind of use them in a way that's helpful for you.
Yeah, and I just want to confirm that all of these resources is available on the website. As you can see in the chat, there's a link to the Draw the Line Against Transphobic 2021 resources. So these are available to you, available to anyone. So feel free to share within your own communities. You can download these as PDFs. You can print them out, bring them to groups when we're able to come together in person. And you can also share the link within either classrooms or with your friends or whoever.
Yeah. And then the putting learning into action 2 is where this is all about preparing students to develop their ability to be agents of change themselves. So we want to think about raising change agents, and it will tell you how to introduce the resource, and then also there's some discussion questions in here, including some examples of change agents that are out there that are doing really interesting and dynamic work. And then also some questions to discuss as a group. So it's like things like, who is the person or people behind the initiative or campaign? Would you describe this campaign as transformative? A whole bunch of other kind of deep questions to get them thinking about how they can participate in being change agents themselves, particularly in virtual platforms, because that's where we are currently at right now. So hopefully you find that helpful. Like Dennis said, these are going to be up and they're available to you. Please peruse them, and hopefully you find them helpful to help you kind of share the content that we've been talking about tonight. Finally, I just want to leave you with this kind of image. I think we've had like 250 some odd people go through this webinar with us, and I think that when we have these heavy discussions, things can feel like we got a lot of work to do. But what I always feel encouraged about is that if 250 some odd folks attended this webinar, and each of them only pushed back or shifted something in their own space, just one thing in their own spaces, we're looking at over 250 acts to erase transphobia and sexual violence out there in the world. And I think that is really worth our time and so encouraging. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. I will be hanging around for a couple minutes, and I'm going to let Dennis wrap up. So thanks so much for